In this video, I'm identifying and discussing my 10 top wines from 2022. If you missed wines 11 through 25 from last week's video, be sure to check out the pinned comment below. Coming in at number 10 on the list is the 1986 Tempus Vega Sicilia Unico. Located in the Ribera del Duero region of Spain, Tempus Vega Sicilia has been long recognized as not only one of the best wine producers in all of Spain, but indeed one of the very best producers in the entire world. It's a historic producer that was founded way back in the 1860s, but really came into prominence after 1982 when it was acquired by the Alvarez family. Following this acquisition, the Alvarez family invested substantial resources into overhauling the vineyard and also modernizing and upgrading the winemaking equipment. Vega Sicilia is a big fan of extended aging, and they age Valbuena, which is another wine that they produce that's a little bit less expensive than Unico, for about 5 years at the winery before it's released, and the Unico is aged for an impressive 10 years before it's released. This 1986 Unico was a blend that consists of 75% Tinto Fino, which is what they call Tempranillo in Ribera del Duero, and then 25% Cabernet Sauvignon. Following about an hour of air, this wine was extremely impressive. This wine featured a dark fruit profile with black cherry, tar, tobacco, earth, smoke, forest floor, and leather. This wine was harmonious, well-balanced, and complex. This wine is definitely at its peak currently, but there's no rush to drink it, as it will certainly age for another decade or so with no problem. In the United States, new vintages of Unico cost around $500 or so. If you're interested in trying Unico but don't want to splurge on the price, you may want to try Valbuena, which is another wine that's produced by Vega Sicilia, and one that can be purchased for less than half the price of an Unico, but which is still an exceptional wine and one that can be enjoyed a little bit younger than the Unico. In 1836, George Yount planted the very first grapevines in Napa in an area that is now aptly known as Yountville. Some 145 years later, Christian Moueix purchased this historic vineyard, which is called Napanook. At the time of this acquisition, Mr. Moueix was managing his family's famous Bordeaux properties. Following the acquisition, the Bordeaux management concepts in terms of grape growing and winemaking were implemented at the Napa winery, which is called Dominus Estate. Dominus Estate has gone on to become one of the most successful Napa-based wineries of the last several decades. While recent vintages of Dominus Estate frequently flirt with perfection, I prefer my Dominus Estate with substantial age on it. And in my view, you really can't beat the Dominus Estate from the very late 1980s and the 1990s for current drinking. The most recent example of that is the 1994 Dominus Estate, which I recently tasted from 6 Liter, and which comes in at number 9 in my top 10 wines of 2022. This impressive wine was drinking very youthfully from the large format. It featured a magical mix of black and blue fruit, leather, tobacco, pencil lead, cedar, and dried herbs. These flavors were perfectly balanced by abundant acidity. This wine was intensely concentrated yet elegant. If you've not yet tried Dominus Estate wines from the 1990s or the late 1980s, I highly recommend it. It's definitely a wine that I think that you would enjoy, especially if you're a fan of Bordeaux-based wines. New releases of Dominus Estate sell for around $300, but if you'd like to get a feel for the house style, you can definitely look into the wine that's called Napanook, which sells for around $80 to $85 or so, and which is an outstanding wine and one that offers compelling quality for a Napa-based wine. Aged champagne can be polarizing. Some people dislike it because they prefer the freshness and effervescence that comes with younger champagne. For some, however, there are a few things better, and I'm one of those who think that aged champagne can be life-changingly good. The most recent example of that is the next wine in my top 10 wines of 2022, namely the 1976 Dom Perignon Oenotheque. The 1976 Dom Perignon has probably been responsible for at least 3 of my top all-time champagne experiences, and so I'm always very excited to try it. This outstanding champagne had some slight effervescence, but shared many similarities with the Grand Cru White Burgundy at this stage. Deep caramel apples, baked pear, honey roasted almonds, dried red apple were all readily apparent. Rich honeyed spices, funnel cake, toasted brioche, sweet dried herbs, yellow field flowers, and densely powered limestone followed suit in majestic layers of awesomeness. The finish was a gorgeous, complex interplay of sweet and savory that lingered on your palate for well over a minute. Definitely one that is well deserving of the number 8 spot in my top 10 wines of 2022. My tasting group was recently very fortunate to be able to do a comparison tasting of the village wines of Domaine Loire from the challenging 2004 vintage. The Gevrey Chambertin was discussed in last week's video, but today I'm discussing the very impressive 2004 Domaine Leroy Vosne-Romanee, which finished number 7 in my top 10 wines of 2022. Initially reticent, this wine gained weight and expressiveness with some air in the glass. It was never as aromatic as the others, however. As is customary with Leroy, there was tremendous complexity and purity of fruit. Descriptors included sour cherry, blood orange, rose petal, violet, earth, and Asian 5-spice. There was abundant acidity, and the finish was extraordinarily long. A very memorable experience, and one that we will not soon forget. 1964 is a legendary vintage in Rioja, and while I was traveling through Spain this past summer, I found not one, but 2 examples of 1964 Rioja to taste at a restaurant. While one of them was more of a novelty at this stage, the 1964 CUNE Imperial Gran Reserva was simply stunning. The aromatics haunt me to this day. Gorgeous dried red cherry fruit was juxtaposed with leather, forest floor, orange peel, espresso, and mixed spice. This ethereal wine coated your palate like a cashmere sweater on a chilly winter afternoon. This wine had a body that was very similar and reminiscent of an aged, high-end red Burgundy. Just extremely impressive. In fact, we were so impressed with this bottle that we also ordered a 1994 and 2004 CUNE Imperial Gran Reserva so that we could do a comparison tasting of all 3. All 3 of those vintages are considered excellent in Rioja. All 3 of these wines were extraordinary and very, very memorable. The best thing about the CUNE Imperial Gran Reserva is that this is also one of the most affordable wines in my top 10 list, at least for new releases. In fact, even in the United States, you can purchase a bottle of Imperial Gran Reserva from a more recent release for around $70 or so, and you can certainly pick it up for less than that in Europe. The next wine in my top 10 wines of 2022 was served to me blind shortly after I had tasted a 6-liter bottle of 1990 Pichon Baronne and the aforementioned 1994 Dominus Estate from 6-liter. Both of those wines were exceptional, and this wine certainly had some formidable competition, but I could tell with a blind taste of this wine that the quality level rivaled, if not surpassed, those 2 wines. And as it turned out, this wine was the 1989 Chateau Lafite. The 1990 Chateau Lafite finished number 2 in my top 10 wines of 2021, and this wine is certainly very close in quality to that outstanding wine. Aristocratic aromatics of red currant, blackberry, leather, forest floor, tobacco, pencil lead, earth, truffle, and violet were all readily apparent, but the palate was the real showstopper here. This wine featured layer after layer of complex cedar-infused fruit. Way back in 1755, a famous French statesman once said, "I've discovered the wines of Chateau Lafite to be a delicious, generous cordial, comparable to the ambrosia of the gods of Olympus." I certainly agree with him. If you're interested in wine recommendations, wine collecting strategies, and learning more about wine, please do subscribe to my channel. I've been collecting wine for more than 15 years and also have a level 4 diploma from the WSET. So I have both formal certification as well as substantial practical knowledge from the School of Hard Knocks. For those who are wondering, yes, there is absolutely a white wine on my list this year, and what a white wine it is. The 1986 Marques de Murrietta Castillo Ygay Blanco Gran Reserva Especial was the first wine to ever receive a 100-point score from Wine Advocate, and that score was well deserved. This is undoubtedly one of the best white wines that I have ever tasted. This phenomenal wine was aged in oak for 21 years, and then it spent 7 years in concrete, followed by another 3 years in the bottle before it was released in December of 2016. Only 8,125 bottles were produced, and a mere 900 of them made it to the United States. This wine largely consists of Viura, which is also known as Macabeo, but there is a little bit of Malvasia as well. The grapes for this impressive wine were sourced from the Capellania vineyard, which is the highest altitude area of the Ygay estate. The vines were planted way back in 1945. This wine was tasted twice this year with consistent results. One time I had it over a dinner and enjoyed it over 4 hours, and the other time I tasted it over the course of a 4 to 5 hour wine tasting with our tasting group. Numerous discrete descriptors were readily identifiable: lemon, lime, beeswax, honey, orange zest, marzipan, peach, whetstone, and many, many more. Every time you went back to this wine, you got something different. The finish was astonishingly long and complex. Just a truly mind-blowing wine. Incidentally, I also considered including the 2001 Lopez Heredia Tondonia Gran Reserva Rioja Blanco in my top 25 wines this year, but in the end I ultimately decided just to make that one an honorable mention choice. The first time I tasted the legendary 1982 Pichon Lalande, I was absolutely blown away. It had simply outclassed every other wine that I'd ever tasted to that point. Last year, this amazing wine finished number 1 in my top 10 wines of 2021, but this year, a bottle that I tasted came in at number 3 in my top 10 wines of 2022. While some recent past experiences with this wine have proved the adage that there are no great wines, only great bottles, with the first sniff, we knew that this wine was firing on all cylinders. A captivating kaleidoscope of black and red fruit exploded from the glass, along with a mix of cedar, graphite, pencil lead, and beguiling floral aromas. As amazing as the aromatics were, the palate was even better. Silky, supple, sensual, elegant red fruit coated my tongue. Each glorious sip delivered layer after layer of complex flavors. The fruit was astonishingly pure, and the finish was breathtaking. When you have a great bottle of 1982 Pichon Lalande, it can overwhelm your senses like very few wines can. For those who are wondering, new releases of Pichon Lalande sell for about $220 or so in the United States, and probably substantially less than that in Europe. One of my favorite quotes about Chateau yquem comes from a gentleman named Frederick Dard, and Mr. Dard explained that he does not consider Chateau yquem to be a wine because there are an infinite number of wines as such. He prefers the word nectar, the drink of the gods. While I'll do my best to explain what makes Chateau yquem special, even the most eloquent explanation does not do it justice. You simply have to experience it. In fact, in the 1855 classification, there was no other producer that was even comparable, and so Chateau yquem received its own separate classification. Chateau yquem combines the perfect terroir for making sweet wines from noble rot or botrytis with meticulous winemaking. In fact, it takes the fruit from one entire grapevine just to make one glass of Chateau yquem. Not one bottle, but one glass. The vineyard is planted to 80% Semillon and 20% Sauvignon Blanc. As a side note, most top Sauterne is made primarily from Semillon, as Semillon ages much better than Sauvignon Blanc does. The grapes are painstakingly harvested berry by scores of top trained pickers who are able to distinguish between noble rot or black or gray rot, and to only pick a single berry if it's achieved optimal ripeness. This quest for perfection can span weeks and typically requires at least 10 to 12 passes through the vineyard by this crew of trained pickers. Following fermentation, the wine is aged in new French oak for an impressive 30 months. The 1967 Chateau yquem is legendary. It's widely considered to be one of the top 3 vintages of Chateau yquem from the 1900s. Our tasting group chipped in to buy this wine from a 750 milliliter bottle. Descriptors were too numerous to list exhaustively, but included apricot, peach, poached pear, quince, candied ginger, vanilla, cinnamon, praline, mandarin, citron, honey, toasted almonds, honeysuckle, blossom, and saffron. On the palate, this wine was simultaneously powerful and delicate. The ample acidity created tactile tension and perfectly balanced the sweetness and flavors. Just when you think you experienced this wine at peak intensity, it continues to expand on your palate. In France, they say that Chateau yquem spreads like a peacock's tail. Like many dessert wines, Sauterne is out of vogue now, and that includes Chateau yquem. As a result, Chateau yquem is certainly one of the very best values among super high-end collectible wines. When you compare the price of Chateau yquem to top high-end Burgundy or to first growth Bordeaux, you can purchase Chateau yquem for a small fraction of the cost of those other wines of comparable quality. In fact, you can typically expect to pay about $225 for a half bottle of a newer release of Chateau yquem, which, while certainly not inexpensive, is a small fraction of what you would pay for some of those other wines. Better still, with the Chateau yquem, you only need a small taste of it to appreciate it, and so even a half bottle can be enjoyed by a group that includes 8 to 10 people. And if each of you chip in a little bit of money for the purchase of a half bottle, You could do that for as little as $20 to $30 a person. Based in the northern Rhone region of France, Domaine Ygay makes some of my all-time favorite wines. These so-called La wines, which include La Mouline, Lalande, and La Turque, are the crown jewel of the Domaine Ygay lineup. And for Guigal fans, you'd be interested to note that there's a fourth La wine that will be coming out in the not-too-distant future. The Lalande vineyard, which is 100% Syrah, was planted back in 1975 to commemorate Philippe Guigal's birth. Lalande tends to be the most robust of the La wines, both because it has 100% Syrah, which means they don't co-ferment any Viognier in this wine, and because they use the most robust cap management technique on this wine. Specifically, they use the punching down technique. Back in March, our tasting group had a Syrah tasting, which concentrated on some of the best Syrahs in the entire world. Included in that tasting were 2 different vintages of Penfolds Grange, as well as a Chave Hermitage, which is another one of my favorite Syrahs. But it was the 1989 Guigal Lalande Côte Rôtie that was the wine of the night for me that night, and which in fact is my wine of 2022. Descriptors included a beguiling blend of black cherry, plum, smoked meat, licorice, iron, tapenade, white pepper, leather, rosemary, thyme, sage, and many more. These flavors perfectly balanced the abundant acidity. The finish was long, lingering, and extremely complex. After each sip, I sat there in silence, just enjoying it to myself, much like I do when I'm at a museum appreciating an artistic masterpiece. Depending on the vintage, you can sometimes purchase bottles of the La wines for as little as $325 or so in the United States. If there's a top vintage, you may pay a little bit more than that. However, one of my insider tips is to purchase the Chateau d'Ampuis. This is the Guigal wine that offers exceptional quality at a small fraction of the price. You can oftentimes get Chateau d'Ampuis for around $120 a bottle or so.